Hi, my name is Ken Rudin, and I manage the analytics team at Facebook. Historically, in most companies, analytics has been thought of as a service organization really focused on responding to the requests from other areas of the business. But I think the role of the analyst is changing and is becoming much more focused on being a proactive driver of business. And I think the move to big data and that whole genre of thought about how to do analysis that has been named big data is really helping to promote this change because it gives us access to more data, which then means we can have more insights and drive even more value into business. To really embrace this concept of the analyst as a proactive driver of business, you have to think about analytics holistically. When people ask me about analytics, usually the first question I get is, so what technology do you guys use at Facebook? That's an important question, but it's only one of many things you need to think about. Certainly you also need to think about what are the analyses you're doing, and I'll get asked about that quite a bit as well. However, it's less important to talk about the analysis you're doing and more important to talk about what you do with the results of that analysis. To make sure that that can have impact, you really need to focus on two additional areas in this holistic view overall. There's the org structure you have to think about, and then there's also the culture of the company that you have to think about. So let's start with technology. I mentioned it's only one of several pieces, but since it does act as the foundation, it's a good place to start. Now, when you talk about technology and analytics, pretty quickly the discussion goes to big data. And by pretty much any definition, Facebook has big data. But that's not really a meaningful comment because we don't really know what big data means. Most people will say it has to do with certain types of new technologies, and if you're using those, that means you're in the big data camp. But to me, it's much less about the technologies and much more about giving us the ability to solve business needs that have been very difficult to solve using traditional approaches. And these tend to fall into one of three buckets. The first bucket is it allows us to do deeper analysis. We need to do deeper analysis. With big data systems, we can put all of the data into one system, whereas traditionally they had to be in multiple separate siloed systems. When they're in one system, it allows us to find correlations a lot easier. For example, if I want to look at how certain behaviors and actions within Facebook correlate to the nature and the size of my social graph, if I have those in two separate systems, it's harder. It's still possible, but it's harder to do those correlations. If I can put all that data in one system, then I get the ability to do this much, much easier. Also, historically, because we couldn't handle the volume of data, we had to get rid of a lot of the details, and we would only store aggregates and summaries. And that means that the depth to which I can do analysis is limited. And I may not want to just look at the usage of Facebook in Brazil. I want to look at the usage of Facebook in Brazil by men aged 25 to 30 who predominantly use either an iPhone or an Android as the way to access Facebook. If I'm only storing aggregates, it may be very hard to do that because I may not have that level of detail. But if I can store all that detail with a big data system, I get much more insight. The second thing that it allows us in terms of business needs is we can do different types of analyses that in a traditional SQL system are very difficult. Like I want to do graph analysis not just of how closely I'm connected to my friends, but how closely they're connected to each other and see what impact that has. Or an optimization model where I want to figure out of the thousands of stories that I can show you in your news feed, how would I rank them to find the story that will be most engaging to you? And then the third part is we want to be able to iterate faster on the analyses. With traditional SQL systems, everything has to be connected through one schema. I've got my BI tools at the front end, ETL systems in the middle, databases at the back end. If I want to change something, I've got to change the schema through all three. And if I forget to do that, the system breaks. So it tends to be a fairly brittle environment. With big data systems, they tend to be schemaless. So I can change things in different areas with a lot more freedom. So if we're thinking about big data as business needs and less about specific technologies, that means that we're free to use both new and old technologies. And I think that is a really important insight, that the ability to have old and new instead of old or new frees up so many different types of insights for you that you would only be able to get one set of or the other set of if you had to do or versus and. So let me give some examples here. Hadoop in general is something that we use. It's really the core, it's the heart of what we use at Facebook. But Hadoop in general is excellent at letting us explore enormous amounts of data with any kind of flexible approach we want. We have complete flexibility. Relational, however, is really good at traditional business questions. I want to look at my users by geography, by age, by the type of device they use to access Facebook. So specific examples here. With Hadoop, it makes it much easier to figure out things like what countries are our users in. Now, many users tell us what country they're in. Many don't tell us, and we try to infer it from other signals that we have about them, because we want to know usage by country. So Hadoop is a really, really good way of allowing us to do that. It would be very hard to do something like that in SQL. However, if I want to look at the trend of photo uploads over the last 2 years, SQL was designed to do something like that really efficiently and really quickly. So that wraps up the technology. Now let's talk about the analyses that we can do with that technology. And let's take a quick look at how the concept of analysis has evolved over the years. A decade or more ago, we really focused on reporting. People wanted visibility into what's going on in the organization, and analysts were focused on providing that visibility so you could really see what you were doing. That was good, but I think fairly quickly people realized that's not enough. You need to figure out the why behind it. I need insights. Tell me something I don't know about my business. And we even went a step further and said it's not just about understanding and insights, it's about actionable insights. I need to be able to do something with that. But honestly, that's not far enough either. Just because you can do something about it doesn't mean you're going to do something about it. And if you don't actually act on these insights, then there's no value added to the company. So really what you need to focus on is impact, not insights. So what do I mean when I talk about impact? Generally, I'm referring to one of three things. And these don't act in isolation. Often they interact with each other, but let's go through what they are. First, when I talk about impact, I'm talking about the ability to move a metric. Pick a metric that you want to move in one direction, up or down, depends on the metric, and figure out how you're going to move that needle. If you've done that, you've had an impact. Or it can be, I want to have an impact on a product, that something is going to evolve because of the analysis that we're doing on the data. We're finding out how people are using the product. We're finding out how people want to use the product. Based on the data, we are evolving the product from something that's older to something that's newer and a better fit with what your customers, your users are looking for. The third one is about changing a process of how things were done. Maybe the registration process for your product, or any kind of process, both external and internal, that you're changing. If you change any of these, then you've had an impact. You can point to it and say, that's something analytics did. And as I mentioned, they don't act in isolation. Often, if you change a product, the reason you're changing it is because you want to move a metric, and a metric will in fact move. So now we know what impact means and how to identify whether you've had it or not. How do you actually get that to occur? Well, there's really two stages to having impact. The first part are, what are the table stakes? Before I can even think about having impact, I have to have certain things in place. And those things are, first, I need to have a goal. It's really hard to have an impact if you don't know what you're trying to move, if you don't know what your goal is. So you must have a goal that is in some way measurable. Then you have to figure out, how am I going to measure it? I need to define what metric am I going to use to define that this metric is going to determine whether I have or have not hit my goal. And then the last part is, I need to make sure I'm logging the data I need to tell if that metric has actually moved and whether I've actually hit my goal. Once you have that, then you can really start talking about actually having impact. So those are the table stakes. The impact itself, there's this cycle that I refer to as the impact cycle. And you start with an understand phase, go to an identify, and then an execute phase. I'll go into each one of those individually. So starting with the understand phase. The goal of this phase is really to get an understanding of the lay of the land. It helps you figure out what are the questions we need to be asking. What's really going on in this area of my business? What are the areas for improvement? So if you focus on just answering questions, this is something that as an organization will set you up to be reactive. It's not about answering the questions that other people are asking you. It's really about what are the right questions that I need to be asking about the business. So as an analytics team, your job is to figure that out. So for example, if we're looking at messaging, how people send messages back and forth in Facebook, in an understand phase, we would typically look at the who, what, where, why, and when type of questions for anything we're looking at. So for messaging, it would be who's using messaging? What products are they using to send messages? Where are they sending from, or where within an application are they sending messages from? What times during the day do they send messages? How long is it taking people to respond? And then the golden question is, can you actually even get to an understanding of why are they sending messages? Can we understand that? These are the types of things we're looking for. What we're ultimately doing this for is to identify areas where we can improve. So by asking those questions, you will inevitably come up with anomalies, outliers, places where you're over-indexed or under-indexed. And these are the places that you're going to want to dive into, because this is where it will be the easiest for you to have tangible impact. The identify phase is probably the hardest of these phases, because it's a combination of science, where the science is what's identifying the anomalies and the outliers, and it's a combination of art as well, because you have to figure out, what am I going to do with that outlier? How will I address this? And analytics often won't give you that. It will highlight something that you can fix, but won't tell you how to fix it. So in terms of the balance, I really talk about having to balance hippos versus groundhogs. And let me talk about what I mean there. Hippos are what happens when you don't have enough science, when there's not enough data backing up someone's opinion. So if you don't have enough data, the hippo always wins. And the hippo is the person who is pounding their fist on the table saying, I've been here 5 years, I know how this works, I've done this 5 or 6 times, you've only done it once, my opinion is correct here, this is the way we need to go. And if you don't have the data to refute that, the hippo will win. Hippo stands for the highest paid person's opinion. They're the one sitting at the table who says, you need to listen to me, I know more than you do. The flip side of that is the groundhog. And it comes from the classic movie Groundhog Day. And in that movie, you've got Phil, who is somehow stuck living the same day over and over and over again. And in the movie, he falls for Rita and decides he wants to go out on a date with her. And he does, and the date goes horribly. Very, very bad date. And he realizes, though, afterwards, wait a minute, I live every day over and over again. I can do this date over and over again. So what he tries to do is learn each time he goes on a date what she likes. And he figures out, if I can just keep incrementally making these dates a little bit better, she'll eventually fall for me. So he learns that she loves ice skating and piano playing and French poetry, and he mixes all of those into the dates as he has more and more and more of these dates with her, redoing them again and again. It doesn't work. Ultimately, all he's really accomplished is coming up with the best version of a bad date. He never really has this breakthrough doing this process of how to make Rita fall for him. He finally gives up and says, you know what, I'm going to just try and be myself, and that's when she actually falls for him. Now, to me, as an analyst, Groundhog Day is a Hollywood movie about A/B testing. What he's really doing is looking at each date as an experiment and looking at, how do I tweak it a little bit to make it a little better each time? And I also think it's a cautionary tale of having too much science, relying way too much on science, where A/B testing has limits. So though you may get to the best type of date that you can imagine having with her based on the information you've gotten, it's still a bad date. You've hit a local maximum. A/B testing doesn't lead you to the breakthroughs. So you've got to be very careful on this balance of having both the science and both the art combined. That brings us to the final phase, which is the execute phase. This is where you actually make it happen. And there's 3 things you need to do here. First, you have to evangelize the insight that you've got and the things you identified in the prior phase, and get the rest of the team that you're working with focused on actually implementing it. Then once they implement it, now you can do your A/B tests. Now you can do your experiments to figure out how to optimize the idea. And then finally, after each experiment, you have to evaluate it to figure out, did it work, did it not? How do we tweak it and go back again to get the best possible result for that? As I said earlier, it's not about what you're analyzing, though. It's about what you're doing with the analysis. And key to making sure that the analyses actually get implemented, actually get acted on, is the org structure itself. Now, companies tend to have two different org structures for how they structure their analytics team. The first one is we have a centralized organization where you've got all these different business teams and then a central team that services them. The problem with this structure is it sets you up to be very reactive, where you sit there and you wait for the business teams to ask you a question. You have goals like we're going to respond to all requests within 24 hours, but it's all about responding to someone else's requests. And I treat this as like having a quality division where, oh, you know what, someone else is dealing with the quality. It's not us. We'll just do what we do. They'll take care of the quality. In this case, it's like we don't have to worry about data and analysis. This other group will worry about data analysis. It's not us. And also, it leads to the issue where the analysts aren't aligned with the goals very well of the business teams. So often, people then switch to scenario 2, which is this decentralized structure. Or many companies start here as well. And this one is, you know what, we're going to have different business teams, and each team is going to have its own group of analysts. So we get very good alignment between the analysts and the business teams themselves. The problem with this one, though, is it leads to inconsistencies. Since each group has its own analytics team, they're all doing analyses a little bit differently. And they're all counting metrics a little bit differently, and they're all looking at data a little bit differently. So if you ask the same question to these different groups, you'll get multiple different answers. And then you also have the issue of you have different groups trying to build solutions, and since they're not tightly integrated with each other, they don't know that two other groups are already trying to build the same solution, so you've got highly redundant efforts. The model that we're seeing now, and the model that we use within Facebook, that seems to be the most effective, is taking the best of both worlds. It's a centralized team with embedded analysts, and we call this the embedded structure. It starts with different groups, different business organizations having their own analysts within each organization. You may also have layered on top of it a separate group of analysts that kind of work across the team. Some organizations have this, some don't. But the real key difference is that all of those analysts, though they physically are sitting with these different business units, they roll up to and they actually report into a central analytics team. And the advantages you get from that are multiple. First of all, because it's a centralized team, you get those advantages. You get one version of the truth. You get the analysts being able to coordinate so you don't have multiple teams trying to solve the same problem. You have a team that is big enough to take on really big company-wide projects, whereas if they're all distributed in different little groups, no one has enough mass to actually take on these big company-wide projects. It solves that problem. And it also solves the problem of what do your analysts do in terms of a career? If there are one or two analysts in this other business organization, how do they move up? There's no place to go in the analytics organization because there isn't one. Combining that with the embedded analyst model where you've got them sitting with their organizations but they roll up into a central organization, the fact that they are embedded though makes sure that they have very good alignment and increases the opportunities for them to identify areas within the product teams where you can do a lot better. It enables them to be much more proactive. They're sitting there with them, they can express their ideas, they have a seat at the table, they are part of the team. Now, speaking of being part of the team, historically at Facebook and at many companies, this is what a product team used to look like. It was engineering plus PM plus design. But what you really need to get to is an organizational structure, and the embedded model allows this, where you've got engineering, PM, design, and analytics. And once you've got that, you can actually do some things that most people don't really think about. Traditionally, most people have thought about analytics as only happening after the engineering work is done and the product is released. And that's when you'll get to the understand, identify, and execute. Most people, if you ask them, well, we're building out the product now, what do we need analytics for? There's nothing to analyze. That's the traditional approach. But if you're really part of the team, then you'll realize that in the early phases, while you're defining the product, while you're brainstorming, you can turn to the analyst to figure out, well, what should we build? Because one of the main questions to answer what should we build is, how are people currently doing this thing that we're trying to have them do in our new product? Analytics can shed a lot of insight on that and really define the product in the earliest days. In terms of the implementation phase, while they're building the product, how do we set up this framework so that on the day we release the product, we can look at dashboards and reports and really get insight into, are the metrics moving the way we wanted them to? Rather than, okay, we released the product, now we have to start putting all that structure in place, and we won't have any visibility until a month or two after the product is actually out. So when you're really embedded as part of the team, you get the advantage of having influence over the entire product lifecycle, not just the very end. The last thing I want to talk about is culture. And the way I would describe it is, let's look at two sample companies. Company A on the left here, let me describe what they've got. They've got an ultra-fast, really flexible structure for analyzing any data you want really quickly. And the decisions that are made about products, about business areas, are made by people who have years and years of experience, and you can rely on them. And the analysts themselves, how are they measured? They're measured on very clear service-oriented goals of, we're going to get this done within 24 hours of getting requests. 90% of our requests will be done within 24 hours. Sounds very clean and structured. Now look at Company B. They've got MySQL on old servers that nobody else wanted. Things are slow. They use Excel. In terms of how decisions are made, they've got product designers in there arguing with the analysts all the time. It seems chaotic. And then in terms of how analysts are measured, they have this notion of you have to be measured on impact, but it's kind of hard to figure out how to measure impact. So which company would you rather work for? Well, this is a setup. Clearly, you should want to work for Company B, except possibly for the fact that Company A has better systems and faster tools to do analysis with. Everything else is actually better in Company B. Decisions made by people with years of experience, that is the hippo. You want to have designers and analysts and engineers arguing. It means you're part of the discussion. You're sitting at the table. You'll come up with a better answer if you take multiple perspectives into account. And in terms of how to measure yourself, you want to be measured by impact. I'm not saying it's easy to figure out how to be measured by impact, but that's the struggle that you should be fighting, that we want to measure ourselves by impact and learning how to measure yourselves. Just measuring how quickly we can respond to somebody's question is highly reactive. Proactive impact focus is really where you want to be. So how do you create this culture? Really 3 points. You have to define your goals. Without defined goals, you can't have a data-driven culture. They have to be measurable. They have to be focused on what impact is this going to have on the company. You have to make sure that everyone logs all the data you're going to need. Just like people do QA on products, logging has to be thought of the same way. It's not just an afterthought. It's not something we'll do if we get time. It's something that's core to the product development itself. The analysts, they need to think of themselves as part of a product team, not a service organization. They have to come up with big, bold initiatives that they think users are really going to love, whether it's your company's users or your internal users. It doesn't really matter. What can they do that's proactive? And then the third part is you have to provide training, not just to analysts, but to everybody in the company. And the training is not just on the tools. That's half of it. But the other half is the mindset of being proactive, of understanding that analytics is about driving impact. It's not about answering a question someone has. So if you do that, you can end up with a data-driven culture. And so to wrap up, really the thing I want you to take away from this is that as an analyst, the main focus for you is you need to own the outcome. You've got to move the needle. If you haven't moved the needle, if nothing changed, you haven't added any value. If nothing changes, it would have been no different than you not being there in the first place. And if you weren't even there, if it didn't make a difference if you were there or not, how can you say you added value? You have to focus on the impact, moving some needle, changing some product, changing some behavior. To do this, you need to understand the needs of the organization that you're embedded within. If you understand their needs, you will focus on analyses that they are going to be much more likely to adopt because it's what they're focused on and you're aligned with that. Then you've got to evangelize your insights. You can't just hand it off and say, here's what you should do, here's a great white paper on that. You've got to then spend time convincing them. Using whatever marketing and sales skills you've got to evangelize that. And finally, you can drive impact if you do those things. The analysts who do this well are the ones who are changing the futures of their companies. They're the ones who are really driving high impact. And as an analyst, there's no better role that I think we can play in the industry and in our companies. Thank you.